Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's installment of the PENC webinar series. My name is Katie Cox and I'm the PENC Membership Director. I will be serving as moderator for today's presentation. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. You can type those into the questions box and I will read them out loud to the presenters to answer. Today's presenters are Kristen Brickman and Monica Fulkerson. Kristen Brickman is an environmental engineer and project manager at Jacobs, formerly CH2M Hill, and has been in consulting for 12 years. Her professional focus is on site remediation and sustainability, and she is an enthusiastic lifelong learner. She is a graduate of the PENC Leadership Institute and currently serves as Director at Large on the PENC Board of Directors. Monica Fulkerson is the Environmental Engineering Design Lead and Remediation Technology Community of Practice Lead for Jacobs Environmental Solutions Market. Ms. Fulkerson serves as a Senior Technical Consultant, Talent Supervisor, Design Manager, and Project Manager in the Charlotte, North Carolina office. She has more than 16 years of experience with federal and private clients, specializing in site management and remediation projects. Ms. Fulkerson has a BS and MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Virginia Tech. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Good afternoon. I'm Monica Fulkerson, and my colleague Kristen Brickman and I are here to talk about resilience and climate change as design considerations and describe how all disciplines of engineering will need to work together to overcome the challenges of a changing world. The future holds daunting challenges for human society and our environment. Our populations are growing exponentially, the demand for resources is increasing, the climate is changing, and humanity's impact on the planet continues to mount. So the question is, will engineers be able to achieve a better quality of life for our growing population without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same? This presentation is intended to provide an overview of the consensus study report recently released by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine titled Environmental Engineering for the 21st Century, Addressing Grand Challenges. We will describe how the challenges ahead of us are a different nature and larger scale than those faced in the past. And then we'll focus on resiliency as an area of particular concern for engineers and talk about how North Carolina is adapting and discuss the role of the engineer to meet human and environmental needs. Though we, Kristen and I, are environmental engineers, this message is not specifically geared towards our discipline, but instead across all disciplines, as we are all, quote unquote, all in this together and need to consider these items as we design. And before I jump in, I just wanted to make a side note about our all in this together title here. When Kristen and I prepared this abstract for presentation at the annual conference, we hadn't yet heard of coronavirus and had no idea that this tagline would become a common message during the pandemic. So please forgive us for not being original at this point in time. Okay, so the basis of this presentation, as I mentioned, is the consensus study report issued by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, called the Environmental Engineering for the 21st Century, Addressing Grand Challenges. The report was prepared by the most prominent engineers, scientists, and policy experts to identify grand challenges and opportunities in engineering for the next several decades. We want to be very clear that neither Kristen or I contributed to the preparation of this report and that we are in no way taking credit for the content. We're sharing the concepts presented herein as the foundation for discussion of how to consider climate change and resiliency in our profession. The report outlines the crucial role for engineers during this period of dramatic growth and change. The report identifies 5 pressing challenges of the 21st century that engineers are uniquely poised to help advance. Number 1, sustainably supply food, water, and energy. Number 2, curb climate change and adapt to its impacts. Number 3, design a future without pollution and waste. 4, create efficient, healthy, and resilient cities. And finally, the 5th one is to foster informed decisions and actions. I'm going to talk briefly about each of these 5 challenges, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to dig a little deeper and provide some context specifically within North Carolina. So, challenge number 1, sustainably supply food, water, and energy. Providing life's essentials, food, water, and energy, for the world's growing population is a major challenge. Doing so in a manner that does not threaten the environment and the health or productivity of future generations is an even bigger challenge. The key concept for this one is that food, water, and energy are linked. For example, agriculture consumes 80 to 90% of consumptive water use. Agriculture then also releases nutrients and contaminants into the groundwater and surface water bodies, which threaten the remaining water resources. And food production and supply chains consume 30% of global energy. Resource availability will be further strained by population growth, increasing standards of living, and climate change. This slide provides a few examples of how engineering needs to adapt to address this challenge. For example, we need to advance sustainable agriculture, and we can do this by increasing agricultural yields with reduced environmental impacts. We can reduce food waste. Maybe we can change dietary patterns. That means eating a little bit lower on the food chain. We can overcome water scarcity by making innovations in water supply, increasing the efficiency of water use, and redesigning and revitalizing water distribution systems. And we can provide clean energy by using sustainable energy sources where available. Okay, challenge number 2 is to curb climate change and adapt to its impacts. Earth's global average surface temperature increased by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1 degree Celsius, over the past 115 years, and that was at an accelerated rate since the mid-1970s. While that might not seem like a lot, the warming has been accompanied by rising sea levels, shrinking Arctic sea ice, reduced snowpack, and other climatic changes. Many urban areas across the globe have witnessed a significant increase in the number of heat waves. More rain is falling during the heaviest rainfall events, causing flooding and further stressing low-lying coastal zones already vulnerable to storm surges and other causes of temporary coastal flooding, along with sea level rise. In other areas, prolonged dry periods and droughts are increasing the risk of destructive wildfires and water shortages. To address this challenge, engineers are tasked with reducing the rate and magnitude of climate change. We can do this by using energy more efficiently, and we can switch to fuels that produce less carbon dioxide. Another method would be to advance climate intervention strategies. A report came out last month about how even though significantly fewer people are driving or traveling at the moment due to the coronavirus, and that we are in general producing less carbon dioxide emissions, the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere did not show a correlating reduction. Even if human-caused carbon dioxide emissions were to cease entirely today, it would take millennia for natural processes to return Earth's atmosphere to pre-industrial carbon dioxide concentrations. Climate intervention strategies are methods that would actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, including growing plants to be converted to fuel or capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for storage. Finally, we'll need to make efforts to reduce other greenhouse gases. including methane, nitrous oxide, and some industrial gases like hydrofluorocarbons. These comprise about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Methane is introduced into the atmosphere through leaks from oil and gas systems, coal mines, shale gas extraction, and landfills, although agriculture is one of the largest sources of non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. Similarly, nitrous oxides arise from the use of nitrogen fertilizers. So, what do we need to do as engineers? We need to adapt to the climate change impacts. We need to be able to build disaster resilience and reduce the impacts on our ecological systems. We need to adapt our agricultural practices. We need to be able to adapt our infrastructure for sea level rise as well. Lastly, we need to anticipate and respond to health threats. Next, challenge number 3, design a future without pollution and waste. Since the Industrial Revolution, human society has adopted a take, make, dispose model. This introduces pollutants into water, soil, and air, and new contaminants, as we know in North Carolina, continue to be discovered. Throughout much of the 20th century, large-scale chemical production combined with inappropriate chemical handling and waste disposal created an array of legacy hazardous waste sites globally. Technologies to characterize these sites and contain and remove hazardous contaminants have advanced significantly over the past 3 decades, and there have been many successes. This is what Kristen and I are specialized in, and we'd love to work ourselves out of a job. Looking ahead, resource limitations and exposure to mismanaged waste requires a new sustainable model. How can we achieve this? First, we need to prevent pollution and waste in the first place through improved design. This means redesigning products and their production processes to promote resource efficiency, longevity, reuse, repair, and recycling while minimizing pollution. We need to develop and use better tools to better predict and the risks of new and existing chemicals in the environment, including toxicity, fate, and transport. We need to be able to quantify and document the life cycle consequences associated with producing commonly used resources and products and the broad cost and benefits of alternative approaches designed to reduce pollution and waste. We'll need to work with social and behavioral scientists to communicate this information to inform the decisions of consumers, manufacturers, and governments that could incentivize these efforts. And lastly, we'll need to manage or remediate those existing legacy hazardous waste sites and contaminated sites to eliminate harmful exposures and return land to productive use. The other side of this is that we can capture the value of waste. We can quantify waste stream characteristics and identify opportunities to reuse or recover materials traditionally considered as waste. We can identify products that could be manufactured with recycled and reused materials that would have lower cost, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and require less energy to produce. We need to develop new resource recovery technologies and processes for cost-effective recovery of materials and energy from the waste stream. And again, we'll need to work with other sectors, including public health, architecture, urban planning, to integrate engineering designs, processes, and technologies to develop effective approaches to resource recovery with broad societal benefits. Moving on to challenge number 4. The future is increasingly urban. By 2030, 10 more cities are expected to cross the 10 million inhabitant threshold, increasing the number of megacities from 31 to 41. By 2050, cities will be home to 2 billion more people than today, housing 66% of the world's population. We care about this because cities account for 60 to 80% of the world's energy use and 75% of all natural resource use. And cities are more susceptible to threats from extreme events such as floods, heat waves, droughts, and viruses. Aging physical infrastructure represents both a major challenge and a key opportunity to reshape tomorrow's world. The American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated that $4.6 trillion in US infrastructure investment will be needed by 2025, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates worldwide infrastructure needs at 70 trillion by 2030. If this infrastructure were refashioned to support multiple city functions and the lives of residents in an integrated way, it's possible to create cities that are more equitable, efficient, healthy, and resilient. We can accomplish this by optimizing cities in two ways: by increasing the efficiency of individual parts and by making various systems functions together. Kristen's going to talk a little bit more about systems thinking a bit later. We can also consider the benefit of advancing smart cities that capitalize on advances in sensing technology, data, connectivity, artificial intelligence, and participatory governance to optimize operations and resource management. The final challenge presented is to create an environment that fosters informed decisions and actions. We need a paradigm shift to achieve widespread adoption of strategies and technologies. And we need to equip people with information to make wise choices based on an understanding of potential outcomes, costs, and potential risks. We also need experts and stakeholders to act in partnership. These two elements, understanding and stakeholder engagement, create a foundation for identifying and implementing policy, management, and regulatory approaches to promote outcomes that are consistent with the collective priorities. Although the responsibility for engaging stakeholders and fostering full understanding of environmental choices does not lie entirely within the engineers, there is much that the engineering community can contribute. Understanding potential consequences involves making the connection between our actions or inactions and the impacts that these have on the environment and the well-being of different individuals or groups in society. As engineers, we must understand the link between the environment, human well-being, and prosperity. Identifying and quantifying the full set of consequences on the environment and human well-being are active areas of research today, but we have a number of tools to help us, and you're probably familiar with several of these: life cycle analyses, social impact assessments, risk assessments, economic benefit cost analyses, environmental justice analysis, collaborative problem solving, design charrettes. The most elegant solution to these challenges is the one that benefits people, is sustainable for our planet, and is good for business. That wraps up my summary of the consensus study report, so I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to provide some additional details about how this is being addressed in North Carolina. Kristen?
Thank you, Monica. You can go to the next slide. So North Carolina's grand challenges really parallel the challenges that Monica has covered. So this is really complementary. Although kind of specific to North Carolina, we're looking at hurricanes, droughts and wildfires, and floods, which are the climate change impacts, which impact agriculture and food distribution. North Carolina is an exporter, so that in turn affects economy. There's economic disparities and climate and environmental justice issues, which are taking on more and more of a front seat with our social climate today. There's increasing urbanization and population growth near cities. I think if you look at any list of growing cities in the US, North Carolina has quite a few areas that are topping those. And you know, it's a great place to be. So, but we do need to be prepared for that. And there's a wide range of stakeholders depending on where you are in North Carolina. You have environmental groups, social justice groups, local city, county, state agencies. There's tribes in some areas, and there's a strong military presence that also kind of affects some of our coastal and central North Carolina areas. So all of these factors kind of tie together and affect each other, creating our own grand challenges to overcome. The next slide. So what is North Carolina doing about it? And I want to focus specifically on more of the external stressors like extreme weather and climatological issues in this presentation, since those are kind of more easily linked to engineering, more easy to swallow, but they are still huge and involve a lot of different people and systems working together. So a major recent step in bringing resilience into policy was the Disaster Recovery Act of 2016. It's hard to remember because we are in 2020, but 2016 was actually a pretty rough year compared to previous years. Hurricane Matthew blew through and caused a lot of havoc. There were wildfires in western North Carolina and a couple of tropical storms that caused thousand-year flooding on coastal areas. And so what's interesting about this is not the first Disaster Recovery Act that North Carolina has enacted, but of the $100 million total, $11.5 million was allocated to resilient redevelopment planning for the 49 counties that were declared a major disaster by the federal government. And this is kind of key. I looked at some of the other disaster recovery acts, and they're really, you know, there have been nods to long-term planning, but there really hasn't been this much funding allocated towards that specifically. And so you can read a little bit more about it on rebuild.nc.gov. But as of today, there are 50 counties that have resilient redevelopment plans in place. And so it's a really good step in the direction of reacting and adapting to these major stressors that are coming. And Executive Order 80 is really one of the bigger things that address the grand challenges. And a lot of the things that Monica just talked about are covered under Executive Order 80. And this is North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition to a clean energy economy, which was signed 2 years after Hurricane Matthew and about a month after Hurricane Florence. So it was kind of a timely, proactive reaction to what's going on in North Carolina. So we'll go into more details on the next slide. So Executive Order 80 has a couple of specific goals by 2025 to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 2005 levels, increase the number of registered zero emissions vehicles to at least 80,000, and reduce energy consumption per square foot in state-owned buildings by at least 40% from fiscal year 2002 to 2003 levels. And if you just look at those goals, you can kind of see how each one of them can tie into the grand challenges that Monica had just talked about. So if you just pull out the zero emission vehicles, there are a lot of players that need to be coordinated with to be able to reach this goal. You need to have the infrastructure in place. You need to get people to buy these vehicles. You need to have charging stations. You need to be able to have clean energy. If you're going to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you need to make sure that the power plants that these are being plugged into are providing greener energy. And finally, you need to look at the trade-offs and consequences of that reduced amount of gas that's not being used, because the funding for road maintenance comes a lot, in a major part, from the gas tax. And so looking at how this change stresses the system is something that is going to be key for engineers. And so this was thinking ahead, it established the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council, which also stipulated that it needed a publicly accessible web-based portal that details all of the council's actions and recommendations, and that is housed on the DEQ's website. And also it required the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan put together by the DEQ, and that was published in October of 2019, and the North Carolina Zero Emission Vehicle Plan by the DOT, also in October 2019, which details kind of what all needs to come together to reach these goals. And so one of the most recent things coming out of the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council was the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, which came out in June 2020, a couple of weeks ago. And that's also a really good read, which I highly recommend looking into it. If you go on to the next slide. So I wanted to look a little bit more at one of the plans. So this is the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. And it had some specific goals: reducing electric power sector greenhouse gas emissions by 70% below 2005 levels, and then attain carbon neutrality by 2050, which, as Monica had mentioned before, that's it's gonna need a lot of engineers and other fields working together to achieve. Fostering long-term energy affordability and price stability for North Carolina's residents and businesses by modernizing regulatory and planning processes. This ties into the cities and grid planning and infrastructure planning. Accelerate clean energy innovation and development and deployment to create economic opportunities for rural and urban areas of the state. So really, this parallels some of the grand challenges with plans to overcome them. And then they have some key recommendations, which I'm not going to read completely, but it's looking at carbon reduction plans, looking at how to update the grid, looking at resilience and clean energy resource adoption, and how to tie the public into it. And so the Clean Energy Plan really identifies all the different players that need to be working together. So we have academia, we have legislature, we have state and agencies, investor-owned utilities, utilities commissions, co-ops, local government, businesses, others, everybody else. And so to take away from this really is that there's just a lot of key players to actually accomplish these goals. And we have to work together, and there's just a number of different bodies that need to provide input and make changes to the way they operate to meet these goals and recommendations, because it's pretty far sweeping. We're trying to get away from coal. So we're making big changes. So even though it's focused on the energy sector, there's a lot of players, and they will very likely, these plans, to reiterate, they'll very likely have an impact on the work that we do, regardless of what field of engineering that you're in. And if we look at any of the other plans, we'll see the same thing. Next slide. Are you overwhelmed yet? So now we'll talk in general about the engineer's role in all this, and some things that you can do as individual engineers to better prepare yourselves and contribute to your field for the exciting and complicated future that we have. Next slide. So as Monica said, this is going to require a change in approach. Go on to the next slide. So as the title of this says, we're all in this together. So no single engineer or discipline can face these challenges alone. And that's where systems thinking can be really beneficial. Systems thinking requires multi and interdisciplinary teams. And we're not just talking about engineers. So we're not talking about an electrical and civil and mechanical, but we're talking about drawing from all over the place. We're looking at social workers, tribal leaders, lawyers, artists, economists, so on. So systems thinking really allows you to communicate and work with these different fields and understand their importance. Systems thinking also takes a wide view of cause and effect of stressors or actions and assesses the trade-offs. So as we said, life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment looks at all of the flows going into and out of a project or product throughout its life cycle from cradle to grave. So instead of the traditional method, we're kind of looking at like maybe like what all goes into, what are the big wider effects of what you're doing. You also consider regulatory environment and economic drivers outside of just who's paying you now, but you know what's going on the greater picture, and then social behavior and how those fit in with your project or problem that we're trying to solve. And another term, go ahead and click, that we're hopefully going to see more of is resilience thinking. And before I go into what that is, I want to pause and kind of get the definition of resilience out, because it's almost turning into a buzzword. So we're all on the same page. The basic definition of resilience is the ability to return to an original or desired state after experiencing stress or change. That's like the dictionary definition. And then a more nuanced definition that I have really enjoyed reading about is the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city, or an economy, to deal with change and continue to develop. It is about the capacity to use shocks and disturbances like a financial crisis, a pandemic, or climate change to spur renewal and innovative thinking. And that's from whatisresilience.org. And so resilience thinking kind of ties into that second definition. If you'll go ahead and click again. It really embraces learning, diversity, and above all, the belief that humans and nature are strongly coupled to the point that they should be conceived as one social ecological system. So what you do to one piece of it affects another piece. We are all in this together, to beat a dead horse. So it's pretty powerful thinking when you consider how incredibly stressed our system is at this very minute. And so resilience thinking is just another tool to help you cope and adapt and innovate in the face of these major stressors. So next page. So to look at it in another way, as engineers, we typically migrate towards becoming experts in our field. We are hopefully passionate about what we do, and we want to learn as much as we can, and we want to be the best at what we do. And it's impossible to learn everything in school and graduate in 4 to 5 years, so we focus, and specialize. But engineers today really do need to work on having that breadth, that top of the T, to be able to communicate and work collaboratively with the players in the system, which we exist, in order to tackle the challenges that we're facing. So you don't have to get a bunch of extra degrees, but it is helpful to be able to be conversant in these other fields of social sciences, policy, global cultures, because everything that we do has some effect, no matter how small the thing that we're working on is. And so what are some steps that you can take right now? Next slide. So as my bio says, I am a passionate lifelong learner. I love researching and reading and just exploring different things outside of my particular field. But I think that this is also something helpful for all engineers, regardless of where you are in your career, to just continue to cultivate this learning and resilient thinking. So some things that you can do as an individual is read the consumer study report. So it's linked here in the presentation. And then look at some of the North Carolina resources from the energy and climate page. Even if you're not directly working in energy, environment, and climate right now, a lot of these will end up trickling down and affecting your field. There's a lot of, I remember kind of a story that somebody had told me in civil engineering, that when they started to install cell towers all over the place, all of a sudden they needed more civil engineers to look at retrofitting buildings and making sure that they could actually install these cell towers on there. So when we look at decentralized electrical grids, we are going to need all hands on deck to figure out where to put these different methods of getting electricity, solar panels, wind generators, that kind of stuff, where to store it, and how to physically make it happen. So if you're not being affected by this directly today, chances are in the near future you will be looking at different ways to adapt to climate change in North Carolina specifically. Research. So this is by no means exhaustive, but looking up these different terms and kind of getting yourself familiar, maybe reading some journal articles or watching some TED Talks or microlearning, but looking up resiliency, systems thinking, life cycle impact assessment and life cycle analysis. Circular economy is another thing that I've seen more and more. Multi-criteria decision analysis and multi-objective decision analysis is a really great way to get stakeholders all kind of on the same page and facilitate decision making with diverse groups of people. Again, you don't have to be an expert in it, but an awareness level is really helpful to just be able to talk with your facilitator. And really understanding environmental justice and the environmental justice movement. There's a lot of groups now of disadvantaged or historically disadvantaged and low-income people that are getting more active and wanting to be coming to the decision-making table. So really getting a better understanding of what's going on in the world is will really help you be able to innovate and react. And you never know what interesting thing you'll bring back to your work. So I highly encourage a little bit of self-research. And certification. So neither Monica nor I are associated with the U.S. Green Building Council or Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, but both LEED and Envision have really great prescriptive processes for incorporating climate change into design. So LEED, of course, is more building oriented, and I think they have some operations that that you can change. And then Envision is more on the infrastructure side, so looking at large infrastructure projects and how to make them more resilient and reduce the overall footprint of the project that you're working on. And so even if you don't get certified, just reading the manual will help kind of spur some ideas, and they're really, I really highly encourage, if you're not already, to look into those. So really, the role of the engineer is to be an expert in your field, but continue to learn and expand your knowledge base outside of your comfort zone so you're better prepared to adapt and innovate in the face of these major stressors. And I think and hope that, you know, we've all kind of seen the COVID-19 stressor, that we're kind of coming out with maybe more of an innovative and optimistic view of how we can approach our problems in the future. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
All right, so we have one that I think is for Monica's section of the presentation. Do you think that the focus should at first be placed on the most distressed counties, so tier 1 in North Carolina?
That is an interesting question. My immediate response is that there are certainly components of this that are more applicable immediately in certain areas. But that in order to make the largest and most lasting impact, it's going to require adoption across the state, across the country, across the world. But I mean, I certainly think there could be value in starting with those most stressed. Kristen, do you have a take on that one?
I think Is there any other context about what to?
No, I'll see if whoever asked that question could add some more context. I'll let you know. Dealing with environmental justice and disparities.
Again, I think my answer comes back to these are all things that have to be considered in conjunction with everything else. I guess I would struggle on how to prioritize any one component over another in that nature. That is a good question. That's a tough question. I might like to think about it a little bit more and perhaps maybe come back with a more intelligent response. I'll send it over to Kristen to see if that helps clarify for her at all.
It does, and I don't have a great answer. So that is a really great question.
All right, we will move on. We've got several more come through. Does the report or any of these NC initiatives consider that these shocks and stressors are happening in tandem? For example, we have aging infrastructure failing due to extreme weather events, all happening during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think that the report does acknowledge that all of these things are happening. I mean, the report was issued before COVID, but I think the concept is there that all of these things are related and impacting other areas of impact. And certainly locally, our eyes are on the legislature to see what type of stimulus, what type of influence various stimulus packages have on things like infrastructure, and if we'll be able to move things forward and be able to build some of these concepts in as we do move those projects forward. Kristen, anything in particular on the North Carolina side?
I mean, they use terms about like interconnectedness, multidisciplinary. They have a lot of stakeholder input, like a wide variety of stakeholder input into these plans. And so, I mean, I don't know that anybody planned for all of this simultaneously happening, but but they do like try to address everything, or yeah, like they do plan for addressing everything all at the same time, that like, okay, we can fix the infrastructure, but we still have this other problem of hurricanes happening, pandemics happening. So like I think the idea of it being a system, interconnected system, is built into these plans.
Right.
Okay. What organizations or NC agencies would you recommend that engineers get involved with to help be a part of the conversation or bring resources to the table?
We think you should be involved with the professional engineers of North Carolina. Seriously though, we do. I'll put on my executive committee hat for just a moment and say we do work with lobbyists, and we are involving ourselves in ways that make sense for engineers. Outside of that, I think just local community involvement, being aware of what's happening in your community, and many of these things go to public meetings or other ways of engaging the community. As far as particular organizations in North Carolina, do you have any suggestions, Kristen?
Well, I was going to say the ACEC PENC Environmental and Energy Working Group, or I don't know if they're called the working group, but if you look that up, that's a group that I was kind of liaising with, and they do have like groups of engineers that go and meet with the DEQ and talk about, like, like what's going on, advising on maybe like our input on policy and stuff with that. And so that's actually a pretty active group that has a lot of different specialties, but work towards kind of a common goal. But yeah, as far as agencies go, I mean, I think DEQ is the main hub for these resilience plans and climate.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, if nothing else, just browsing around the DEQ website and seeing what they have available or maybe of interest.
All right, there is most likely a high capital cost for these projects, however worthwhile. How do you see this working with the goal to keep costs stable?
I think that's a really great question because the only way this works is if it's cost effective. We're in consulting, right? Kristen and I, we know that it's wonderful to incorporate these concepts as long as it doesn't influence the bottom line, right? Or if we can put some kind of tangible value on what's being gained by implementing some of these steps. So I think that's a really key component to the discussion is that, and as we talk about innovative technologies and procedures, that has to be a driver. That we have to be able to show, whether it be the life cycle, cost reduction, the long-term impacts, or just it has to make sense from a business perspective if this is going to be successful. That's my opinion. I'll let Kristen chime in as well.
Well, and I mean, I think that question is basically like one of the grand challenges. Like, you can't really do anything if nobody's going to pay for it. So, and that's one of the things that the plans kind of address, or at least identify, like who needs to be involved in coming up with this. So at this point, I think it's still pretty theoretical. But that is a great question and consideration.
All right, is population growth control an unavoidable goal?
Ooh, I hope not. I hope that's not where we're going. I've not read anything to that effect.
Okay.
Same here.
Okay. In terms of resilient infrastructure projects, what have you heard on the funding front other than 11.5 million allocated to resilient redevelopment in the Disaster Recovery Act of 2016?
I do not have that answer.
You guys are asking tough questions.
Yeah, these are really good questions
out here.
Any questions that you would like to expand on, I can get you in touch with the person that asked it, and we can follow up that way.
Yeah, for something like that, we may need to go back and look at the programs a little bit more to get additional details.
Yeah, I mean, I think Clean NC might have information, at least for like rebuilding with a resilience twist. But other than that, I don't really have anything specific.
Next question. So we are 5 years into a 10-year plan to reduce greenhouse gases. How are we doing?
There's definitely more work to be done. This is going to be an ongoing problem, and it's bigger than carpooling, and it's bigger than zero emission vehicles. So I think we've made good progress, but I think we still have a lot further to go in order to make an impact.
And I actually, so I'm actually on the hub, and I don't see anything yet because the plans were, or like the goals were stated in 2019. So I don't really see any sort of progress towards the greenhouse gas goals publicly available. It's still plans that I'm seeing.
All right, next question. Who or what organization is responsible for quantifying Executive Order 80, measuring and reporting?
So North Carolina DEQ is responsible for the reporting, and then the DOT is responsible for the zero emissions vehicles portion of that. And then Department of Commerce is also involved, but it's housed and hosted and mostly managed by the DEQ.
Okay. Is there a plan to recoup the lost tax revenue from the gas tax this year and the coming months and years as our society adapts?
Boy, that is
So-
above our pay grade. I think that's a DOT question. What do you have for that, Kristen?
I don't have anything right now, but I do think it is in the zero emission vehicle plan.
You do think it is in the plan?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have
Okay.
that off the top of my head.
Next question. The same behavioral attitude that requires a change in how we approach these problems seems to be missing. We can't even get younger people to wear their masks. How would you propose we begin to educate the non-scientific and non-engineering public on how to change their thinking?
That's a great question.
That is a really great question.
I mean, including, wearing masks, I think it comes down to education and having to get our messages out to as many different people in as many different ways as possible. We need to, I mentioned earlier, we need to equip people with the right information, not necessarily the headline that you see on your social, but the facts around this so that we can have intelligent conversations around this topic. So my answer is education. Did you have anything to add, Kristen?
I think definitely education. I was going to say a clear and consistent message, but that's really hard with the way that our news and I'm putting news in quotes, but with the way that people consume media and information, because there's so much misinformation. So I don't know, can we fix that?
All right.
Yeah, education and understanding what is fact versus what is non-fact.
We'll do one last question. There's a company in North Carolina that is selling wood pellets to foreign countries to use for fuel. Trees are an important source for storing carbon dioxide. Can companies damaging the natural environment for economic gain be controlled for effects on climate change?
Well, that's a really good question. And that goes into looking at the life cycle of a product. So if you were to actually say you are responsible for the whole life cycle of your product, then you would have to take into account the burning in the other country that your product is going to be causing, and then the carbon dioxide that it's releasing. So I think legislature would need to take a more systems or life cycle view of regulating. I don't know how to make that happen, but that is a really good question or comment.
It is, and it's a bit of a slippery slope too. If we apply that to a certain type of product or to a certain, for a certain export, and we apply that across the board. Is that fair? I agree with Kristen that comes in into some legislative questions. But the systems thinking on that one, I think, is the key. Are we getting more benefit out of it than the harm that we're causing?
All right, Monica and Kristen, thank you. That was a lot of questions. We appreciate your thoughtful responses. If anyone had an additional question, we'll connect you with the presenters offline. Any last comments, Kristen and Monica?
Well, we'd like to leave you with this final thought. This is the quote. This is the correct quote from John Muir. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe.
All right, well, thank you so much for presenting today and sharing your time and expertise with us. Attendees, everyone on, thank you for participating. If you have additional questions, you can see their contact information on the screen there. PDH forms and the NC Bells survey will be emailed out to you this afternoon. The PDH form is for your records, but the NC Bells survey needs to be returned to me. Our next webinar is July 1st, Challenges to PEs from the Upcoming Wave of Automated Vehicles. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.